My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Hi, everyone. Today we are talking to Dr. Oren Kroll-Zeldin, who is the Assistant Director of the SWAKE program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. Oren is also an assistant professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He just published his first book, Unsettled: American Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine. We can't wait to talk more about Unsettled and Oren's journey with him today. So Oren, tell us about your work in a broad scope and what brought you to what you're doing now.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to speak with you. Well, broadly speaking, I grew up in a very normative Jewish household in a small town in Southern California called Los Angeles. And I didn't really think that any type of Jewish studies or Jewish education would be part of my professional journey because I am the child of a rabbi and the grandchild of a rabbi, and thought I would go far away from that. But I went through a long process of distancing myself and then returning back through graduate studies where I started learning more and more and more about different parts of Jewish life and my own Jewish identity. And that really brought me to this particular book project, which is both ethnographic and autoethnographic, where I look at myself and my own journey into a process sort of unlearning Zionism, of becoming a Palestine solidarity activist myself, and seeing myself mirrored in many of the activists that I was researching. So when I went through this research project, I realized that in many ways I was actually looking at myself and my own history, my own background as an American Jew, and realized that my story was so similar to so many others. And it was actually the people that I worked with in doing research that helped me uncover a lot about myself and my own story. So it really was a profoundly humbling moment of truly learning from my interlocutors.
I'm just curious about that role between researcher, subject, interviewee, interviewer, kind of the dynamics that play out there and how that maybe sounds like a subversion in some ways of that power dynamic, or maybe it was kind of a blurring of a line between being the researcher and being researched a little bit.
Yeah. Well, let me share a story. I spent some time with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence doing a delegation in the winter of 2019, 2020. And I went on this delegation in part because of my shared political commitments with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And I went partially because I wanted to experience firsthand doing field work, what they were working on the ground in the West Bank. So through that process, I met a lot of really, really incredible people. Let me back up and say that I think for quite some time I had a tremendous discomfort with Jewish ritual and Jewish religious engagement. And I realized that part of the reason why is I had a hard time separating Judaism from Zionism on a personal level. And part of that has to do with my upbringing in a Jewish day school that was deeply pro-Israel, and in a youth group environment and a synagogue that was in an Israel positive context, so to speak. So it was already difficult for me to separate Israel and Zionism and Judaism. So even after I had already unlearned much of the Zionism that I was raised with, I still had a discomfort over religious ritual and certain Jewish spiritual practices. In meeting the activists that I was working with at the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, some of them in particular really struck me as doing an incredible job of being very outspoken, active participants in the movement for justice in Palestine, while also holding on very closely to the significance of Jewish rites and rituals in their lives. And when I saw their ability to hold these things simultaneously, I was moved by it. And I was also very, very influenced by seeing how they did this. And for me, it was very much an instance of seeing the theory put into practice. And then myself, I felt it. We did, after a big action we did in the West Bank, it was on a Friday. That Friday night, we were in a hotel in Bethlehem doing Kabbalat Shabbat rituals, and I felt very uncomfortable. I thought, what is this? Why are we, a group of Jews, engaging in Kabbalat Shabbat and these Jewish rituals of Shabbat in the occupied West Bank? Who does that in the occupied West Bank? It's the settlers. That's who does that, who does what we're doing. And it was very challenging for me, and really I had a deeply emotional, sort of reactive sensation to it. The next night we did Havdalah to mark the end of Shabbat. And I was able to, in that moment of doing Shabbat, understand that there are different ways of engaging with Jewish religious life, that even in the occupied West Bank, just a short walk away from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Manger Square, for example, like that we could still have a deeply important, meaningful Jewish experience, even within the context of Palestine solidarity activism. And we could be both engaging in Jewish ritual and working to towards the liberation of Palestinians and Jews and others. And so that for me was like, wow, I'm really learning so much, not just from the fieldwork experience, but from the people that I was doing research with. The people that I was there to quote unquote study actually ended up being my teachers. And this is truly in a sense, a really great success story for both research, but also education. And I still hold on to that in really powerful and meaningful ways.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that feels like such a familiar experience to like come to working towards Palestinian liberation and doing organizing around Palestine as a Jewish person and like not seeing how Jewish spirituality or ritual can fit into that at first, which is why I think there is a theme of a lot of Jewish like people who are activists for Palestine being very secular and like not doing a lot of ritual. I think for me, it was like really powerful and special to realize that like those two can coexist. And I think that's really driven a lot of the work that Jesse and I do, which is like being very intentional about centering our values related to Palestinian liberation and being intentional about like sort of extracting the parts of Zionism that have infiltrated Jewish ritual and getting back to like practicing Judaism for what it is, which like has existed long before Zionism infiltrated it. And I think that like more and more people are starting to come back to that as more of these like anti-Zionist Jewish ritual spaces form. Um, and I think that's really powerful and really special. It was really nice to hear your process of like first feeling really like a lot of discomfort with it and then like moving towards a place of acceptance.
Yeah, I'm really inspired by all of the activist groups that have existed for a long time and that continue to spring up, that are working distinctly within a not just a Jewish context, but actually a Jewish religious context, whether or not that's halachic left or Yaseh Mishpat, people who are like deeply religious and engaging in anti-occupation, anti-apartheid activism through that lens. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, and I do think, like, I mean, I think there's a lot to say for this, but I do think that causes a reaction from people who are not Jewish to see very, like, visibly Jewish people engaging in, like, anti-Zionist action and, Palestinian liberation. I There's a lot we could go into here with, like, um, the problems with that, and I think, like, when it's done in ways like people on the halachic left are doing, like, yeah, that can be really meaningful. I'm gonna pivot us a little bit because we have a lot of questions about the book, so I wanna, like, bring us back to that point. For folks who have not been lucky enough to read the book yet, could you give listeners a very brief overview of what the book discusses?
Yeah, the book looks at young Jewish American activists, millennial and Gen Z Jewish American activists who are part of the broad ecosystem of the Palestine solidarity movement. It argues that these people are coming to be active participants in this movement as a Jewish value, as an expression of their Jewish ethics, and as a way of performing their Jewish identities. In many ways, I'm looking at a response to critics who look at Jewish American Palestine solidarity activists and like, at worst, they're self-hating or anti-Semitic, or critiquing them as being naive, not understanding, uh, or saying they're not actually Jewish, which is so often what we hear about groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. Like, they're not even Jewish. I'm responding to that in this book to say it's not only that they are Jewish, but they are engaging in this work as Jews in very, very intentional ways. And there are really important reasons for them to show up as Jews in Palestine solidarity organizing. I'm also looking in this book at three main strands or strategies, tactics of organizing. The first is targeting mainstream Jewish American organizations, targeting the American Jewish establishment that has worked very hard to uphold the status quo and maintain policies of apartheid and occupation. The second strand is co-resistance activism of Palestinian and Jews resisting on the ground through shared political commitments for equality and justice. Most of this work happens in the West Bank, but also in East Jerusalem and other places. And then the third tactic is the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement, the participation of young American Jews in that.
Oren is very intentional about the communities that he's writing about in this book and acknowledges that it's an intentional choice to talk about the Jewish organizing experience in this moment, and that is not happening in a way that is supposed to be centering Jews in this conversation. Oren has written a lot about the importance of decentering Jews in the Palestinian liberation movement and has spent a lot of time centering Palestinians. So I just want to give that caveat for people who have not read the book that that is not the angle Oren is taking. And you should read it because I think the way that you explained it was really yeah, really succinct and like helped me feel comfortable with what was happening in the book.
I'll just say that I really borrowed from a friend and colleague and comrade, Sarah Ann Minkin, who wrote an important article calling Palestinians the present absentees in Jewish organizing. And very much Palestinians are the present absentees in this story and in this book. And we need to acknowledge that in robust ways. And there also is a role for Jewish Americans to be playing in the sort of multi-pronged approach towards liberation. And that's what I'm focusing on here.
Yeah, I think the idea that Jews do not have a very specific and powerful role to play is an oversimplification of what's happening. Like, I do think that obviously Palestinians should be central. Palestinians should be leading the movement, and Jews should be taking cues from them. And like inherently, this is grounded in Zionism, which is coming out of Judaism. And so Jews have this ability to really change public opinion that other people don't have because they are not Jewish and can't say the same things or have the same experiences. So, yeah, I think that's
Absolutely.
important.
And Jews in the United States have a particular role to play, which is that, first of all, about 40% of Jews worldwide live in the United States. Second of all, as citizens of the United States, they are citizens of empire and are taxpayers and supporters of the US government, which is deeply, deeply embedded in helping Israel to further its project.
It was really helpful when you shared about the categories that you split the different like tactics into for this book, because I think as someone who was primarily organizing on college campuses in like 2014 through 2017, I felt that this really reflected my lived experience. And I'm curious, this book was completely researched and written at the end of 2021, post October 7th and college encampments. How might this book be different if research was conducted during this year of activism?
Yeah, I've been wrestling with this a lot. So the book was already in publication on October 7th, and I wrestled a lot with what it meant to have this book with nothing referencing the events of October 7th and everything that has come since then, including the campus activism, which has been quite profound. What I think is that everything that is happening now, that has been happening since October 7th, none of it is actually new. Everything that is happening now was already happening before October 7th. It's just that right now, everything is happening in more intense ways. It's like everything is on steroids. So the armed resistance was already happening. It just is now on steroids. Israeli state violence has always been happening. It's just on steroids now. Is like Israeli bombardments in Gaza had already been happening. It's just happening in more intense ways than ever before. The arguing in the United States about anti-Semitism or Zionism has already been happening. Campus organizing was already happening. BDS was already happening. Everything is just happening on heightened levels of intensity, like it's on steroids. So I don't think that the book written today would necessarily be all that different. It might look at different stories or different instances of how co-resistance activism functions, or how people are targeting mainstream Jewish institutions in the United States, or how BDS campaigns have changed since October 7th. But all of those things already were happening. And at the same time, everything is completely different since October 7th. Because of the heightened nature of this, we see that Palestinians are being continuously invisibilized and like more powerful than ever. And this is a new reality that I think a different iteration of this book might respond to, in terms of how young American Jews are thinking about that and wrestling with that in this particular moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is really important to note. I feel like the core difference is just that like it's entered the mainstream in a way that it was on the fringes for so long, and now it feels like, I mean, I guess I don't know if it's fully in the mainstream yet, but at least people are talking about what's happening in Palestine, even if not everyone is on the same page about what's happening there, in a way that I think is unprecedented. And so I think, yeah, I think you're right to say that all of these things were happening. All of this was already happening, except now it's just amplified so much. This is sort of another question about like, would this be different in your book if you wrote it now? In your book, it focuses on 4 activist organizations: Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and All That's Left. Could you share a little bit more about your process for selecting these organizations? And then looking back, do you think you would still choose to analyze Jewish Palestine solidarity work through these 4 organizations?
The process was based on the main sort of strategies or tactics of activism that I mentioned earlier. When I realized that these are the 3 primary ways at the grassroots level where young Jewish American activists are working, that's when I started to select which sort of groups, organizations I would work with. I should note that there are other ways that young Jewish Americans work on Palestine solidarity activism beyond these 3 strands. Lobbying in Congress, for example, is a really powerful way, and through political action committees. But I'm really trying to focus at the grassroots level. When I wanted to look at who or what is happening in the activist spaces where people are targeting mainstream Jewish American institutions, if not now, is the primary way where that is happening. Since 2014, if not now, has been the go-to place for people interested in targeting mainstream American Jewish institutions. And the early campaigns of If Not Now highlighted the ways in which that happens. The hashtag You Never Told Me, or the birthright walk-offs of the summer 2018 were very, very prominent. I would still focus on that strategy and on that organization. I think that the work of If Not Now has been essential in bringing more and more people into the conversation, but also turning them from passive into active participants in this movement. I think that that's extraordinarily important. Co-resistance activism. Again, when I started looking into co-resistance activism, the 2 groups that stood out to me as being the most prominent that incorporated young Jewish Americans. So again, I'm using my research frameworks to guide how I'm trying to understand these questions. All That's Left is the primary place originally for millennial Jews and then Gen Z Jews going to Israel, Palestine, who want to connect with co-resistance work on the ground. All That's Left is a central access point to connect to other people. Same with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. The Center for Jewish Nonviolence is now run almost exclusively by young American Jews, millennial Jews, who are bringing significant groups of people into the West Bank to engage with co-resistance activism. They are very much following the lead from their Palestinian partners on the ground. They're only showing up when they are invited to, and they are training scores of diaspora Jews, so to speak, on nonviolent direct action and on co-resistance activism, how to do this in ethical, responsible ways when following the lead of Palestinian partners. Again, I would do the same research and follow those groups today. Although things are morphing, things are changing. This is an ongoing sort of situation, but I still find those groups to be central in that. When it comes to the BDS movement, boycott, divestments, and sanctions, Jewish Voice for Peace is the central actor in the Jewish part of the conversation. I would absolutely continue to focus on JVP and their campus organizing, in addition to some of the other actions that they are doing in terms of bringing Jews into BDS activism. Now, there's a couple of other groups that I think are interesting to think about. Should they be included? Why did I not include them? Why might they be included? Now, first of all, there's a proliferation of groups, both on sort of a national scale, but also a local scale. So if I wanted to do this, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. If I wanted to do sort of very local and not a transnational ethnographic project, I could focus on lots of different groups in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, all the way down to maybe Santa Cruz, with different groups that are popping up and working on this, again, from various angles. But at the national level or the international level, IJAN, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, I could include them, didn't include them because in large numbers, the cohort of people that I was looking at, millennial and Gen Z Jews, were not extraordinarily active in that group. And J Street, oftentimes people are like, well, why didn't you include J Street? J Street U is this very prominent organization, this very prominent group that's working on precisely the intersection that you're talking about. I did not include them for two reasons. One, I don't believe that they fit within one of these three main strategies or tactics of activism and of organizing. I see it less as a grassroots organization and more as a political group. And second, J Street is like a gateway drug into more radical forms of activism. A lot of people, when they're in college, they go to J Street U things because they're like exploring what is it like to try on this potentially pro-Israel, pro-peace, meaning also I'm anti-occupation, trying this identity on. And that brings them into more radical forms of organizing. So maybe that means they get involved with JVP or with If Not Now or something else. So J Street is really the gateway drug. But it turns out, actually, and I didn't write about this in the book, but for many people, If Not Now is also a gateway drug into more radical forms of organizing and activism. But If Not Now is so important and so central to the story of young American Jewish Palestine solidarity activism that I think it would actually be irresponsible. It would be almost scholarly malpractice not to engage with If Not Now.
It's actually so funny that you said that, because Jesse and I literally had just been talking about how, like, we were like, honestly, If Not Now kind of also feels like a gateway to like more radical orgs. And I think it's important, like you're doing research and you're taking like a historical look at like what happened in these moments, and whether or not like myself or Jesse or like leftist Jews are like, oh yeah, I completely agree with like all of If Not Now's values and policies, they still have played a role in the movement that you're talking about. And so it's still important to discuss like what that role was. So yeah, I do think that's important to acknowledge. Something that came up for me off the bat was like, oh, like, I don't know if I resonate with these organizations specifically. And then I had to like challenge myself a little bit and really think about, if I am someone who believes in like growth and transformative justice, like the fact that people can do like change, I think that also applies to grassroots organizations. Like I do think we need to move out of this stage of just like canceling an organization before it has the chance to like change and grow. And I do think a lot of these organizations have like moved farther to the left based on pressure from the people who are a part of those organizations. And I think that's important to acknowledge. Like, I like when thinking about this interview and reading your book, I like looked up these different organizations' statements on what happened on October 7th. And I was actually really surprised by a lot of them because I was like, oh, that's actually not what I thought they said or not what I would have thought they had said, in that it was like more of a leftist take than I would have anticipated. Um, and I kind of had to check myself and be like, you know what? Yeah, maybe I need to step back and like give a little bit more grace. Um, do I think this applies to like nonprofit industrial complex orgs? No, not always. But when we're talking about like grassroots orgs, I do think it matters. And so I appreciated that kind of like challenge to myself when reading this because it did really make me think. Um, I also think it's hard because when I think about it, like I can't think of an organization that is like a Jewish organization working towards Palestinian liberation that is more radical. Like I just don't think it exists yet. So I think it's either we have to keep moving those organizations that do exist further and further left, or someone needs to like come up with one that's doing it. And so, like, if what people are looking for is to be organizing with other Jews, because I think the other option is like organize with Palestinians and like join organizations that are Palestinian led. Those are some of the things that were coming up for me that I was just like really chewing on.
I think that it's important to remember that on the one hand, it's about the organizations, but on the other hand, it's not about the organizations at all. It's about the movement. And each one of these organizations, no organization is perfect because organizations and institutions are made up of individuals and individuals are imperfect. So these organizations all have a role to play. And justice and liberation are possible when there is a broad-based coalition working collectively, everyone in their own sort of lanes, to ensure that people are pushed further and further and further towards the ultimate end goal. Someone might say, if not now, that ain't for me. But y'all have a great time. I fully support that. And someone might say, Jewish Voice for Peace, that ain't for me, but y'all go ahead and do that. All of these things are really important. There's someone who I interviewed for the book, and this is in the book. This is an activist who has been living in Jerusalem for a very, very long time, originally from the United States, currently lives in Jerusalem, has lived there for a very long time, and is very active in co-resistance activism. I asked this person what they thought about these different movement orgs, like how the different orgs work. And what they said was, listen, I live here. I work doing co-resistance activism here, and I find that to be very meaningful. I don't want to go back to New York and be protesting in front of a federation building somewhere. That's not for me. I'm so glad that they're doing that, and I think there's a role for that, but that's not for me. Each person's going to find their own organization or their organizations. And if one doesn't exist, people are going to create it. That's what happened with If Not Now. That's what happened in the 1990s with Jewish Voice for Peace. That's what happens anytime there's a void to be filled. People are starting to create their own things. But the important thing is that all of these organizations and collectives work within the framework of a broad ecosystem of Palestine solidarity organizing, and the Jewish piece is one tiny circle in a large, large ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. It's true. Like Jews who are drenched in Zionism have to first unlearn it, and often that has to happen through a Jewish context. So there have to be places that exist where people can unlearn it before getting further involved. And so, yeah, all of these things are pieces in the puzzle, and I think we can lose sight of that and kind of be myopic.
It's so funny too that you say that about the co-resistance activists being so critical of Jews protesting in front of the Federation. Because I am a protest in front of the Federation, whatever kind of activist who is very, very critical of co-resistance. and has like a lot of thoughts about co-resistance. And that will lead us to our next question. But I also just want to like take a moment to note, as Alana is kind of noting their own experience, just like I was very fortunate to join a Students for Justice in Palestine group in college that had one or two other Jews in it, but also was led by like a very strong Palestinian leadership team that like really helped me kind of just like check some things quickly in a way that like I didn't really have a Jewish organizing space on campus. And so I'm like, I don't even know what it would have been like to have an If Not Now or a JVP, but I was fortunate. So it's interesting, like just checking where all of our experiences have brought us and why that leads us to be critical of each other. And as Alana's saying, like we can't continue to fight each other and to the point of not existing anymore. Like we have to recognize that there are lanes. With all of that in mind, speaking about co-resistance specifically, in Israel's repression of activists today, we see that Israel is willing to kill even Americans in the West Bank and Palestine. Do you still think that diasporic Jews can effectively leverage their privilege in Palestine to protect Palestinians during direct actions?
This is another way in which we see sort of everything that already existed still exists, just now on steroids in more intense ways. The simple answer is yes. I still think that American Jews or diasporic Jews can leverage their privilege on the ground in ways to improve the conditions of everyday life for Palestinian communities. That's the simple answer. Of course, nothing is ever so simple. Things are way more dangerous now for everyone. All eyes are on Gaza, and we see that that is cover for Israeli forces to increase the violence in the West Bank, increase killings of Palestinians, mostly in the West Bank, to increase the repression, increase arrests, increase home demolitions, increase creeping annexation, and other mechanisms of occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. And that makes everything a whole lot more dangerous for people. Of course, it's most dangerous for Palestinians. Diasporic Jews doing co-resistance activism need to be a lot more thoughtful and strategic. And let's be clear, Palestinians were inviting diasporic Jews to participate in co-resistance activism. If they don't invite people, then nobody's coming, because co-resistance is predicated on Palestinian leadership. Nobody can protect anyone fully, ever, and that's only the more so now. However, I think that co-resistance activism has two main goals. One is material and the other is symbolic. The material goals are literally improving the conditions of everyday life on the ground for Palestinians. I still think it's possible for material goals to be realized through co-resistance, but in this heightened moment of violence, it's harder for Jews to leverage their privilege effectively. On a symbolic level, however, I continue to think that co-resistance activism is extraordinarily important and significant in two ways. The first is it's showing Palestinians, Jewish Israelis, and the broader world that Palestinians and Jews refuse to be enemies. Second, it shows the world that their safety and security of these two groups is inextricably linked to one another. That the safety and security of Jews in this highly securitized state of Israel can never come at the expense of the safety and security of Palestinians. And therefore, co-resistance activism symbolically shows people that there has to be a shared future for these two groups, and that the safety and security of all is intertwined. I'm curious, what's your critique of co-resistance activism? The reason I'm asking is because I told this story in this book about the the co-resistance activist critique. I don't have a story in the book of a um, protest in front of the Federation's critique of co-resistance activism. So I would love to hear it so that I can share it.
Yeah, well, and also this is my positionality given everything I gave before, and also as someone who has not traveled to Palestine at all and has not engaged in a co-resistance action effort. I think some of the critiques I have are actually some that you raise in the book, that in some ways it does center Jewishness or Jewish identity, and oftentimes that's like white American Jewishness, sometimes incidentally, which we can talk about more in a question that comes up later, but also it still normalizes certain aspects of like the Israeli state, like traveling there and going through customs and being a person who could travel to Israel safely. And while that is leveraging privilege, sometimes I wonder if it's still centering Jews as I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but almost as like martyrs or in this kind of like savior complex, which can totally be necessary for some people who would, instead of doing that, would do nothing at home if they were back in America. But I think also as someone who works in Jewish institutions a lot in America, I can see how like deeply fucked up they are. And there's sometimes resentment that I'm like, okay, we have like brilliant American Jews who would rather leave everything here and go put their bodies on the line in a different country, which is very cool. But like, why won't you come here and like help me fuck up the ADL? Like, why won't you come here and help me like take down this fucked up program that's happening? So I think that can sometimes be the feelings that arise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a deep ethical conundrum in being a Jew from the United States, going and engaging in co-resistance activism there when there's a lot of work to be done here. It requires an awful lot of privilege to go there. What about the reflections of what's happening here? So I hear you. I love it.
Throughout the book, you make the decision to use the language Palestine Israel, like Palestine/Israel. You also mentioned a class you were teaching that uses the language of Israeli Palestine conflict. I'm always really fascinated by language choices because yeah, language matters, and it was interesting to me, like it struck me that those were different, and also the decision to say Palestine Israel instead of Palestine. Could you share more about the decision making process around using that terminology?
Yes. It was, in a sense, an academic decision, but it was also a political decision. So, first of all, I do not want to alienate readers. This is not only about Palestine, this is also about Israel. And I think it's really important to engage in the multiplicities of both of these societies that are very, very real, rich, and robust. So, if I were writing a different book about a different group and about a different people and about a different place, I might write about Palestine. But this is not about Palestine, this is about Palestine and Israel. So my choice to include Israel is about that. But why Palestine/Israel? To me, this is, in a sense, it's about this is a work where American Jews are largely, although not only, the intended audience. And so by privileging Palestine, putting it first instead of Israel, forces for some readers reckoning or rethinking, why is that first? Why is Palestine there even at all? This is not about Palestine. So this is about, in a sense, forcing a more normative Jewish readership to reckon with Palestine in different ways. Now, why the course title Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if I'm writing about Palestine and Israel, this is a very dissatisfactory response, and it has to do with university bureaucracy. That there's sort of a similar course title on the books for a long time. We are very limited with the number. It's like a Twitter post. We're very limited with the number of characters we can use. And it's not always very easy to get course titles changed. And lastly, there's institutional memory with students and faculty. I don't want to change the name of a very popular course because then people might not know that this is the course to take. So there's nothing all that sort of interesting about why it's called that. But I really appreciate the close textual reading where you notice the difference between, wow, throughout the whole book, he's calling it Palestine/Israel. And now he's talking about this course that he teaches, but it's totally different.
I think it would be cool if you could speak to the course just for like a brief moment. Because Shell, who we also talked to, said to us that your course like changed their life and their perception on this topic. And so I think it would be remiss of us not to ask a little bit about the course. I found it real like I was so fascinated by the section in the book where you're talking about your student Jasmine and her like transformation that takes place over a semester. And I think that this is something that I struggle with so much is like how to move people, how to move Jews from Zionism to unlearning Zionism, anti-Zionism, whatever you want to call it. And it is really, really hard. And so to hear like that this is happening in this course that you're teaching, I was like, okay, whoa, how is this happening? So if you could speak a little bit to the course, I would be very appreciative.
The course takes a multi-narrative approach to understanding the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I always bring both dominant Jewish Israeli and dominant Palestinian narratives into the class, but I also focus a lot on the many sub-narratives and the intra-communal strife that exists to show that both communities are not monolithic. I also frame the entire story or histories of the conflict within the framework of social justice, where we're thinking about the ultimate goal of social justice in some ways being the equitable distribution of resources in a society that is mutually shaped to meet the needs of everyone, where we are all psychologically and physically safe and secure. So every moment in the history of the conflict or every iteration of a particular moment in history, we think about it through that lens. I don't shy away from difficult topics. We talk about things like ethnic cleansing and apartheid and settler colonialism and nationalism and violence and nonviolence. And we talk about it all in a very open environment. And so my hope is that people leave the class with more questions than answers, but also that their questions are more sort of deeply rooted in a rich and informed understanding of the complexities of what's happening on the ground. And I don't know. It's up to them how they're moved. It's not me. It's the students. If they're moved, it's because they're open to learning new things. They're open to unlearning. They're open to being challenged. They're open to understanding things that have been so deeply ingrained in them in new and different ways. Is it a student who's willing to put in a lot of work because they'll get as much out of the class as they put into it? So I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate that others have told you that it's a really transformative class. I want it to be. It often is for students, But I really think that that's more about them and who they are and how they approach it than it is anything else. Because if you come into a class that teaches about the War of Independence and about the Nakba, if you're not open to narratives of the Nakba, well, then you're not going to be transformed by this class. But if you come in willing to learn, open to the idea that people experienced what maybe others did as a redemption, as a catastrophe, well, then you're going to learn a lot and you might be changed.
Do you feel like the class is very self-selecting? I feel like you kind of just answered that, but it's like, do you find that there are people who are taking it to be provocative, especially in more recent years?
It's quite the opposite. And listen, I teach at the University of San Francisco. It's a very unique place. I think if I were teaching this at somewhere else, it might be different. But the students who are there are so deeply interested in actually learning. And the four walls of the classroom are so exciting and really sacred in a sense of people really just engaging with all the noise from outside absolutely comes into the classroom, but people are there because they want to learn. It's also self-selecting in the sense that this course fills up really very, very, very fast. So it's usually only upper class students who have the opportunity to take it because by the time first and second year students can register, the class is full. And so it's self-selecting in that for a couple of years, so maybe students had wanted to take the class and they're like, finally, I got in, I'm going to take this class. And they're really engaged in there to learn.
I think the framing of willingness to learn is really interesting and kind of gets at what I actually find the issue to be is like, I think people who are willing to learn, we can get there. But what I struggle so much with is how to get people who are unwilling to learn to the place of being willing to learn. Something that really struck me was you say in the book that your grandfather believed the establishment of the state of Israel was a modern day miracle. And very recently, my grandmother used literally that exact language. I mean, as we know, there are plenty of people in older generations who have like been with it from the get-go. There's no real like, oh, age makes such a huge difference. And there are a lot of people in older generations, like you discuss in your book, who are closer to the Holocaust, have more of a historical memory, who are very protective of Israel and of Zionism. Have you had any success in moving people, whether in older generations or younger generations, towards a willingness to learn?
Yes, I have. My grandfather is no longer alive. I would never have moved him. There are certain people who are so entrenched and are not willing or open to new ideas, or who are so deeply entrenched in their beliefs because of their own personal experiences. So we cannot move everybody. I like to think about it as you drop a rock into a pond and there's ripples, right? So if I changed one person, that person can then change someone else, who can then change someone else. And there's those ripple effects that way. So I don't need to take it on myself to move everybody. However, I have been very successful, I think, in moving a lot of people only because of a lot of time and effort. So I could just use my own family as an example. The word occupation was never uttered in the house that I grew up in. I never knew anything about anything regarding Palestinian experiences or narratives. I didn't know that there was such a thing as an occupation. As I started learning different narratives, spending more and more and more time in Palestinian communities, would come back and tell my family, I did this, I experienced that, I witnessed this, this is what I'm learning, this is what my dissertation looks at, this is what my research is on. And over time, slowly but surely, it's like erosion. I'm eroding away at certain things. Now, words like occupation are every day, Nakba, things that were once unspoken are now assumed in our conversations. So it absolutely requires an openness and a willingness. And yeah, we collectively can be successful if we just keep going. I will also say that the radical right-wing shift of the Israeli government and the extreme hawkish policies of the Israeli government and the horrific acts of violence of the Israeli military are doing a lot of the work on our behalf, because these things don't match up with the liberal values of most American Jews. And so when they see those things, I don't have to talk. I don't have to say anything. The state of Israel is doing that work already to alienate people and to start moving them. That doesn't mean that someone who says that the establishment of the state of Israel is the greatest miracle of my lifetime, that can still be the case for that person. And that person could also say, this is horrific. This genocide in Gaza is unacceptable. Those two things can happen, can be simultaneously. That person can hold multiple truths. We as individuals are very complex vessels that can hold a lot. And so our grandparents can hold both of those things simultaneously.
Do you avoid the word genocide when talking about like apartheid, colonization, like all of that? Or do you use it in your class? You just don't like put it in the like title?
Well, I'm not teaching a course on Israeli genocide. If I wanted to teach a course on Israeli genocide, I'd put that in the title and I'd do that. I do put a chapter that I wrote on Israeli apartheid on the syllabus because that's a bigger part of the story.
Unsettled makes mention of nonviolence as a core tool in movements for change. As we've seen, nonviolent protests by Palestinians are ignored and often even met with violence by Israel, such as the March of Return in 2018 and numerous other incidents. As your book notes, even Jewish people engaging in nonviolent coexistence are met with violence from Israel. In your book, you note Jerusalem Day Flag March in 2017. What place would you say that violence has in catalyzing movement change?
First of all, I'll say that it's not within my right to tell a group how they should resist their experiences of oppression. I don't think that I can do that. It's not for me to say. So let's use that as a sort of a framework for understanding the rest of my response to this. For a very, very long time, for the last 10 years that I've taught this class, the very beginning of the semester, I have students read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where we think collectively about the value and strategy of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. Then the next class, we read Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, the chapter on violence, and we think about the role of violence and armed struggle in the context of decolonial struggles. And I have the students write what they think about whether or not violence is justified or legitimate to overcome severe conditions of oppression. On the one hand, this is very clearly a theoretical exercise, and on the other hand, in no way, shape, or form is this a theoretical exercise because it is very real. When it comes to the state in and of itself is a violent project. So if we're talking about violence, whose violence are we talking about? Whose violence is legitimate? Whose violence is okay? Who has the authority to say that this is violent and this is not violent, right? When we hear in the media about a riot, so to speak, well, as soon as you use the word riot, you have absolutely delegitimized the movement right off the bat because riots are violent and violence is bad. So, if we're going to talk about armed resistance as violence, are we also going to talk about military violence in the same way? Are we going to equate, or are we going to talk in the same way about the armed struggle, armed resistance as terrorism? What about state violence as terrorism? Like, who gets to define that term? Well, what we've seen, as you've noted, is that the state of Israel has very effectively delegitimized any and every form of armed struggle for Palestinians. But Israel has also very effectively, well, less effectively disarmed Palestinians, but very effectively delegitimized any and every form of nonviolent resistance. Palestinians try to go to the United Nations for statehood. That hits certain snags. But what about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? This is the largest international nonviolent struggle for Palestinian resistance in Palestinian history. And that has also been delegitimized. So, what are they supposed to do? Armed struggle, not okay. Nonviolent resistance, not okay. When nothing is okay, what do? You use your bodies and your voices to make yourself heard. I think that the armed struggle, the acts of violence by Hamas on October 7th made the voices of the people in Gaza heard, even if they don't like Hamas, even if they didn't like what happened. Look, this is now part of the international conversation. You can no longer move the Palestinian issue to the side. I can also point to the research that says, social science research that points to the fact that nonviolent social movements are much more likely to be effective than violent social movements. Like Erica Chenoweth is like the main scholar who has proven this. So that's an important bracket. Me personally, I think that violence is in any of the forms that we have that I have talked about it is not very strategic, nor is it morally or ethically acceptable. Any type of terrorism, if that's state violence or armed insurrection. And I don't think that ultimately it is the most effective way to make change. It brings things to the fore, but it also doesn't get you all the way to the ultimate end goal of justice, of equality, of liberation. But I'm curious to know, what do you both think about this? I mean, this is very much front and center of the conversation today.
I mean, I would say largely we both agree with what you just said. So I would say that we're on the same page, I would say. I think it's so important to note the fact that like the state, all states, all empires are violent first and foremost. And so like we have to move from there, and that's just not a viewpoint from which most people are moving. We've been so brainwashed, fooled into like not being able to understand the state as violent that people can't even get past that and understand that. Someone else talked about this recently, this idea that like any death that has been caused, regardless of who it is, has been caused by Zionism, has been caused by the violence of Zionism. Period, point blank. I think this idea that it's like if people being moved to armed resistance is happening because they are experiencing violence from the state. That violence is predicating violence in the form of resistance because it's been proven there is no other way to make their voices heard. And then even in this way, as we see, like the backlash from getting their voices heard is horrific. It's resulted in almost a year. By the time this episode comes out, literally, God willing, there will miraculously be an end to the current violence by the time this episode comes out. If not, it will have been a year, over a year of this current iteration of genocide. I don't know. I wish I had more answers, because inherently I think I am someone who is of the belief that to end a violent system, you have to meet it with violence. Because as like so many different thinkers and intellectuals that I respect have said, we can't fight back against the oppressor without using the tools of the oppressor. Like the oppressor is only going to respond to what they recognize, which is violence. And so that is sort of where I come to my thoughts on violence from. I don't think it's the only move. I think it has to be in conjunction with other forms of movement change. Because if we're just working from violence and we don't have ideas about where to go after, it's just going to result in more cycles of violence. So I do think there has to be this level of like deep intention behind the violence. And I think sometimes that's where it's lacking. But I also don't think that the state is being intentional with its violence either. So yeah, my answer is that I think that violence absolutely has a place in catalyzing movement change. And like we're talking about, it exists in a larger circle of different things that are moving things along.
Yeah, it's funny to place myself like where I was right before October 7th. I had just decided that despite my differences with, if not now, I was going to jump into there or drop the ADL, fighting this whole Christians United for Israel kind of like campaign that was going on in Congress. And I was like, okay, I don't agree with everything they say, but like I can at least join this movement. And I went to this whole weekend that they did, and they passed out, like these are the, if not now, core points of unity or whatever. And I saw one of theirs was like a firm commitment to nonviolence. Like violence is never acceptable in any movement. And I kind of had the reaction that you were just talking about, Oren, of like, who am I to tell an entire nation of people how to resist oppression, like especially as someone who shares a lot of identities with the dominant group that is oppressing them. And like that feeling stuck with me. And then when October 7th happened, I was like 2 days later, I was like, I can't continue to be a part of it, if not now, like meaningfully, just because even though they like ended up saying a lot of things that I think pushed them in a certain direction, I was like, ultimately, this group is not supportive of the things that I think I'm feeling right now. And we even put out a statement I was making mentions right after being like, we firmly commit ourselves to supporting Palestinian resistance, by any means necessary, and not super well received. So I think Alana and I have been operating in the space of getting a lot of negative feedback from holding that like resistance by any means necessary is valid. And I think I'm not familiar with the research that you're talking about, Oren, but I think that question about like what you were talking about with co-resistance being material and also symbolic, I think is like an important thing to talk about with violence as well. And I'm thinking of the Kwame Ture quote, like nonviolence only works when your oppressor has a conscience and the US has none. And I think that's similar to what we're seeing in Israel right now. And I think that is also what you alluded to before. It has been growing with this like hawkish far right policy that maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we could talk about like how nonviolence and like a slow building movement could affect change. But I think what I'm always critical of is like, what change? Like, are we asking Palestinians to nonviolently commit to campaign for human rights in Israeli government? Or are we asking them to try to liberate an entire nation through nonviolence only? And so I think it's a question about like goals. And if the goals is to still exist within the framework of the Israeli state, that is one tactic. But I think it's a question of like, where are we headed and like, what is our goal ultimately?
Absolutely. Nice to hear what you both think about this. It's continues to be conducive to my own thinking on it. So I appreciate that. Also, I'll say one last thing, which is that like there really is not going to be a military solution to this situation. There no Israeli military solution, no any international military force, no Palestinian military solution. That will not be the solution to the perpetual cycles of violence. So things need to change.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about that question, because I think there are actually a lot of academics who would refuse to answer that question or would not engage with violence as a legitimate form of change making. And so I think it's really exciting that you are allowing this space here. And I'm also hopeful that means in your classroom, this conversation really has a home and a space to be with students in a way that they can be lovingly challenged and also supported. This conversation has been incredible. I'm so excited for everyone to listen to it. And unfortunately, we are coming to the end of it now. And we always ask our interviewees, if you could leave our listeners with one message, what would it be?
Well, I might be preaching to the choir based on who the audience of this podcast is, but I think that one of the reasons I wrote this book, I really want people to take seriously the fact that there is a significant and growing movement of American Jews who are very important players in the Palestine solidarity movement, who are challenging American Jewish communities, who are challenging their own families, who are distancing themselves from Israel, who are unlearning Zionism, who can't be ignored in the Jewish community. And the more people or institutions try to ostracize those with these dissenting viewpoints from the mainstream, the more those institutions will become irrelevant, because they must adapt with the changing conditions of Jewish life in the 21st century. Jewish life has always survived and been predicated on adaptability. So in this particular moment, I really hope that the collective we will be able to adapt in such a way as to include these dissenting voices and understand their significant Jewish contributions to our moment.
Well, I would certainly say that our listeners would agree with that. And we appreciate you saying it and bringing it to the forefront, and we so appreciate you being willing to talk with us today and engaging in such juicy conversation about your book. I really encourage everyone to read Unsettled. I definitely think that it challenged me in different ways and gave me information I didn't have before. And so you should all get into it, and then come and listen to this interview again with the context. Thank you so much for being here, Oren. It was so great talking to you.
Thank you for having me. Loved speaking with you both.
Thanks for listening to Making Menches. As an explicitly anti-Zionist grassroots org, we don't receive any institutional funding or support. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmenches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Menches, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.